Hello, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan. We're speaking to Dr. Huong Le Thu, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Australia. Dr. Le Thu, now I want to talk a little bit about Vietnam's relationship with China, because not only is Vietnam's economy closely linked to China, but both countries are also geopolitical rivals in the South China Sea. And being neighbors, how is that relationship during this time of the pandemic? Could you elaborate for us?
Well, Vietnam has been experiencing a series of coercive activities in the South China Sea during and even before the pandemic, but some activities have resurfaced and intensified during this pandemic. We've had incidents at the sea in April where the Chinese ship allegedly were coercing the Vietnamese ships, and as a result, Vietnam has actually put a complaint to the UN body. So, and this year is Vietnam's ASEAN chair, so it is very important for Vietnam to play the role well. And the South China Sea and territorial dispute have been a very important issue on the regional agenda. But obviously, the pandemic has prevented many meetings, has delayed many meetings, as well as have made it more difficult for leaders to be fully concentrating on regional issues when they are fighting the pandemic. So some of the meetings have been put on the online platform, just like we do, and a lot of the agenda of discussion has moved to the issues of pandemic rather than traditional security threats, such as the maritime issues. Obviously, they're still being debated, but obviously there are other more pressing issues to discuss.
Right, Dr. Le Thu, before we get into the ASEAN kind of regional mechanisms dealing with the pandemic that were actually enunciated by the Vietnamese Prime Minister, I think in the last ASEAN meeting that was held, what other levels of engagement are there with China? In Malaysia, Chinese doctors from Wuhan came and have, had a look at our response and have shared their experiences. Are there those kinds of relationships, of levels of engagement between Vietnam and China over the COVID pandemic?
Well, Vietnam is, like I said, has engaged with China through the framework of ASEAN, because China-ASEAN had met over the pandemic earlier this year, so Vietnam was a part of it. But I'm not aware of Chinese bilateral efforts similar to the ones in Malaysia.
Just to come back to the ASEAN, the regional response, again, that Vietnam is the chair of this year's ASEAN summit. Now, critics have actually, I guess, pointed out that ASEAN has been rather sluggish in developing a regional response to the pandemic. Is Vietnam likely to take the lead or to step back at this point in time as more countries approach a nation-first strategy in dealing with it?
Yes, so primarily there have been national response. Obviously, this is a pandemic that affects a region and the world broader, but it is an emergency, and emergency, as I mentioned before, the faster the better, and a regional multilateral cooperation requires some coordination, so some extra time, which is not necessarily helpful in a quick and fast response. So at the time being, the ASEAN as a regional response is more of sharing information about the virus, sharing research, sharing best practices, how each countries are dealing with social distancing measures, when are they lifting up and how are they lifting up in gradual mode. So a lot of knowledge sharing. The ASEAN framework actually has had for a long time dialogues on pandemic and transmissible diseases. But when the COVID hit, it was in such a scale, I don't think any of the ASEAN member states had anticipated how big and how contagious it was. So I think they are reviewing the previous, measures in place, the best practices, the early warning systems, and information sharing. I think in the later stage, when we're talking about the economic recovery and the collective measures, how this region should proceed from here. As you know, this health crisis will spill over into an economic crisis.
Dr. Le Thu, before we get into the economic crisis, can I just ask you if the conversation in Vietnam, or the conversation that Vietnam wants to lead, includes things like vaccines and equal access to vaccines across the region, the differing levels of affluence across the region, how does that affect access to healthcare when a vaccine is developed, for instance? Is that part of the conversation that Vietnam wants to champion?
Yes, for sure. I mean, Vietnam has been pushing for the online meetings to carry on rather than to wait until leaders can meet. So at least there are some frequent and even constant communications. As far as I know, there are WhatsApp groups for the ASEAN leaders to stay in touch every day if they need to. And also the issue of sharing test kits, sharing PPEs, personal protective equipment, other medical issues before we get to the vaccine. It's a long, long time of the research and trials before we get to the vaccine. But at the moment, even not all countries have the capacity to conduct their own tests. For example, earlier on, Myanmar had to send their tests to Thailand, for example. And not all of the countries have sufficient laboratories to conduct tests. So we are still in the very early stage of reacting and responding to the virus before we can get to the vaccines. And obviously, vaccine must be equally available for everyone, because the region will not be safe if everyone is not safe.
Can I come back very quickly to something you mentioned earlier? You touched very briefly on Vietnam's innovation with test kits. I was wondering whether you could share a little bit more about that.
Yes, that was a very interesting development from very early on. I think already I saw in February, March that Vietnam not only was successful in developing its own kits, testing kits, but it was able to export beyond the region and as well as far as to Europe. So it was quite interesting development. At the moment, Vietnam is both exporting the test kits as well as masks and other protective personal equipment, so very much medical supplies. Vietnam has consolidated a lot of efforts to develop the laboratories that are able to conduct tests. For example, earlier on there was only a handful. By April it was over 100 laboratories that were able to conduct tests. So it is quite an effort, not only in terms of containing physically and isolating people, but also measuring and being very adequate in identifying the cases. And that was one of the success stories why Vietnam had been able to contain the spread so well.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. More on Vietnam's response to the COVID-19 pandemic in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This.